My name is Christian Hudak, and I am the Executive Director of the Dunhuang Foundation. And we are the organization that has created this set of webinars, and this is the third in a series of 5. And we hope for those of you that are new, that you are joining us for the new ones that will be coming out every 2 weeks. The fourth one will be on Buddhist art, and that will be a lecture given by Anne Fung, who is a professor at Boston University. And then the last one will be on the imperial culture of Chang'an, and that will be given by Professor Christopher Nugent from Williams College, who's a specialist on Tang poetry and also culture of the Tang dynasty. So without any further ado, I'm going to speak a little bit about tonight's lecture. Once again, thank you all for coming. It's a huge honor to share my time with you, and rather for you to share your time with me. I'm just a nonprofit director, and really I see it as our job here at the foundation to ensure that we're creating content that is meaningful, engaging, and is really something that our participants, supporters, and just people that are generally interested from the public want to take part in. So this is a great step in that direction. Our speaker tonight is a gentleman by the name of Jann Ronis. Jann is the executive director of the Buddhist Digital Resource Center, which is located in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Jann is a Buddhist studies, he's a student of Buddhist studies. He did his doctoral studies at the University of Virginia, and he taught at the University of California at Berkeley, first as a postdoc, and then he stayed on there for another 5 years or so before becoming the director of the BDRC, the Buddhist Digital Resource Center. And he is a specialist on Tibet, but his lecture tonight is actually going to focus a little bit more broadly about Buddhist tradition and culture, the movement of Buddhism from South Asia into China, and then he will conclude by speaking a little bit about the disbursement of Buddhism around the West more generally. It's a really interesting topic. It's our first talk on Buddhism. For those of you that are more familiar with Buddhism, and I know that we have some folks that are joining us from a number of different organizations, the BDRC, as well as our friends at the Rubens Museum in New York, some friends from the Asia Art Archive, and our own supporters. So to all of you, thank you again for spending your time with us, and I really look forward to your comments. Before we start, the one thing I'm going to say is that since there are so many people tonight, there is, if you look on your screen, there should be a Q&A box. And the way that these lectures work, for those of you that haven't attended before, is that we break them into 2 sections. The first section is 30 to 35 minutes of lecture that Jann will do. And then we will have a Q&A period, and that'll be 10 to 15 minutes in length. If you have any questions that arise during the lecture, feel free to send them to us via chat. My colleague, Julia Grimes, who will be moderating the Q&A session, and she's the Deputy Director of the Dunhuang Foundation, she will be moderating those questions along with me. Once we do that, there'll be a 5-minute break, and then the second part of the lecture followed by a last Q&A. The lectures last about an hour and a half, so we should be wrapped up by 7:30 Central Time, and that's what we aim to do. So without any further ado, I introduce to you Jann Ronis.
Great, thank you, Christian, from one nonprofit guy to another. So thanks to you, Christian, Julia, Mimi, and the rest of the Dunhuang Foundation. Over the last couple of years since I arrived at BDRC, the Dunhuang Foundation has been one of our most interesting and productive new partners. And that's because we share a mission of conservation and education about Asian art and culture. So it's great to be working together. And I really look forward to getting back on the road with you all as soon as that becomes possible again. Because I'm not sure how long my lecture will take, let me just start showing you my slides and begin with the brief presentation I have planned. And then I really look forward to your questions about 30 minutes from now. So as you see, it says sharing is paused. Bring your shared window to the front. Is the sharing paused? Oops. Now I'm sharing. All right, well, let me just I'll show you the slides and try to make them as large as possible. And if it's Christian,
not to interrupt you, but when you have it enlarged, you can see it just fine on our end, so it should be okay.
Oh, okay, good. Yeah, I had a message saying it was paused, but
don't worry.
All right, sorry about that false start. So welcome to my talk. It's called Silks and Sutras. And there's no particular meaning to that other than the, reference to the Silk Road and the alliteration. The more substantive part of the title is Buddhism at Dunhuang and Beyond. And so as Christian mentioned, this is in many ways just a basic primer on Buddhism, how it got to Dunhuang and beyond to China. And then time permitting, I hope that we'll have a few minutes to discuss the further westward movement of Buddhism to North America in the 19th and 20th centuries. Again, my name is Jann Ronis at the Buddhist Digital Resource Center, BDRC. All right, the Buddha. Buddha, many of you probably already know this, but the name is a title, and it denotes the awakened one who has woken up from ignorance and misery. The name that the Buddha had at birth was Siddhartha, Prince Siddhartha, born into a royal family in India in the 5th century BCE. And the area that he was born into is known as the Gangetic Plains, and his birthplace is Lumbini, which is in present-day Nepal. But more geographically, you can see that it's right there at the foothills of the Himalayas and also in the Gangetic Plains. And that's important because just a few decades before his birth, this whole area went through a dramatic change, one that is called the second wave of urbanization. And we don't have to go into that, but just know that just before he was born, there was a dramatic shift from small-scale villages to city-states in this area along the Ganges River.
Excuse me, Jann.
Yes.
Hi. So there's, I think there's a text color box that's available. Are you able to move your slides? Are you seeing them on your screen?
Yes.
So we're not seeing them on this side. We're just seeing the title screen.
Still? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. How about now?
That looks great now.
Okay. Yeah. So my apologies for this. All right. Well, here's the map. And so Lumbini is where the Buddha was born. It's a UNESCO site these days, and it can be reached from Kathmandu by bus. And then the Buddha became enlightened at Bodh Gaya. You can see it's quite a distance from Lumbini, and that's where the Buddha sat under a tree for 7 days and attained enlightenment. Then another important site for early Buddhism is Sarnath, which is where the Buddha gave his first teachings at around age 40. And then he continued to deliver sermons and attract disciples and offer pastoral care to rulers and local people alike until he was 80 years old, and then he passed away. The Buddha was not the only major religious figure of his time. Because of the social and cultural upheaval surrounding the second wave of urbanization, religion changed and adapted to the alterations to daily life and to politics. And so many people were developing new styles of philosophy and religiosity and community building. The Buddha was just one of them, but he ended up being the most successful, so to speak, successful in the sense that his tradition exists, to this day and spread all throughout Asia. And that's probably due to the fact that he was a prince. And so he, was trained in administration from his earliest days and was always expected to be a leader. Of course, that doesn't explain everything about the tradition. Its success is probably largely due to the brilliance of its founding ideas and traditions. And so this new sort of style of religiosity of which the Buddha took part is known as the Renunciant Movement. And that makes sense. Renunciant in the sense of renouncing society, because we all know that the Buddha was a wandering monk, and in that way, a renunciant. All right, so what I would like to do now is to talk about a few founding ideas of Buddhism. This is just a preliminary lecture, and so we're not going to be able to cover difficult points of philosophy or some of the legalism of the monastic code. I want to actually just bring up three terms, and you probably have already heard all three before, but you may not have seen them defined or seen these three terms related so closely together. But I think it's probably safest for us just to zero in on a couple of key terms to see how they connect up conceptually, and then try to show how these three terms are really central to the organization of Buddhist culture and institutions, namely the way that the monks and the laity interact with one another. So the first of these three terms is samsara. And of the three, this may be the one that some of you have never heard before, although there was a time when I think it was Yves Saint Laurent had a line of perfume called Samsara. I'm sure that term has been used in other marketing campaigns as well. But for us, it means the cycle of life, death, and rebirth. And this is very much a concept that was developed as part of the Renunciant movement, right? The Renunciants were leaving society and quotidian life behind. Why? Not because daily life itself is so agonizing, but because they understood themselves to be living in an uncontrolled cycle of repeated birth and death and rebirth. And so they thought that was, a dead end, so to speak, and that drastic measures were needed in order to break the cycle. And so they thought that the cycle could be broken by a couple of different means, but one of them, renouncing everyday life, leaving your family behind, leaving behind the comforts of fame, sensual pleasure, and so forth, donning robes and living outdoors and begging for food. As you can see the Buddha there. So samsara, the cycle of death and rebirth. The second term is karma. So karma, right, is a very common term in everyday American parlance. But let me tell you what the Buddhist definition of karma is. Karma is ethically weighted action. So in other words, karma literally means action, but it has a particular valence, namely that every action that you do is ethically weighted, namely that it can be judged in terms of whether it is virtuous or non-virtuous. And of course, there's a spectrum. And then furthermore, actions, not only can they be judged according to their ethical weight, but because of samsara, every action generates a reaction, so to speak. But that sounds, for Buddhism, or rather for the Buddhist case, that's a little too unclear. What karmic actions generate are not just reactions, but future experiences, and future experiences whose experiential quality is conditioned by the ethical weight of the karma that gave rise to it. So again, every action that you do based on your intention and the effect of the action can be ethically weighted. And it's not judged by a god or by some tribunal of humans or by your own conscience. It's just part of natural law. Fire is hot, water is wet, and doing nice things will ineluctably lead to pleasant experiences in the future. And doing non-virtuous things, lying, stealing, and killing, and so on, will necessarily lead to very unpleasant experiences in the future. And now you might ask, well, when do these karmic fruitions take place? It's not in this life. 99% of karmic fruition happens in a future life. And again, that's just part of natural law according to Buddhism. So for now, let's just kind of grant them the benefit of the doubt when it comes to that. The third term is nirvana. This is another term that I'm sure that most of you have heard of before. Oh yeah, one more thing before I leave karma. As you can see, karma is not instant. Certainly, it's not instant karma. Karma is not fate. Karma is not revenge. It's not most of the things that we typically think it to be in everyday English. Just wanted to point that out. All right, let's move on to nirvana. So nirvana is liberation. It's the extinction of the causes of samsara. So samsara is the cycle of life and death. And karma is the energy that perpetuates samsara. So now what happens if you eliminate the fuel that powers samsara? Then you have liberation, the extinction of the causes of samsara. And you might be thinking, why is Jann explaining this in sort of negative terms? And that's because I'm just simply following the Buddhist explanation. Nirvana is most often described of as simply the freedom from suffering and the causes of suffering at the deepest level. It is not, for instance, heaven. Nirvana is not some pleasant reward in which you, experience just joy and long life and someone serving you, grapes from a beautiful ceramic bowl for all of your days. No, not at all. Nirvana is the extinction of the causes of samsara, and so therefore all of the mental and physical suffering that's bound up with samsara and karma. So these are the three terms that I want to talk about today: samsara, karma, and nirvana. I hope that they are helping you get a better sense for the original meanings of these important words in Buddhism, but also in Indian religion more generally. And so if you don't mind, let's move on to a couple of very basic quotes that I think say a lot about Buddhism. And they all come from the Dhammapada, which is a collection of verses, sort of words of wisdom that have been transmitted in Buddhist communities for centuries and centuries. So one says, "Others do not realize we here are struggling. Those who realize this, for them are quarrels therefore quelled." And so this speaks to samsara and suffering. Most people don't understand that we're in samsara, right? The early Buddhist monks and those people more broadly in the Renunciant movement I'm sure they had to tell their parents and their loved ones, I'm renouncing society. I'm leaving family life behind and my job and my education and whatnot because we are struggling. And by that it means because we are suffering. And suffering, not just the suffering of stubbed toes and illness, but the suffering of, samsara, constant, repeated, uncontrollable death and rebirth. But then it says, but for those who realize this, for them are quarrels therefore quelled. It's kind of Victorian English, but I like it. All right, here's another quote from the Dhammapada. The path of the deathless is awareness. Unawareness, the path of death. Those who are aware do not die. They who are unaware are as dead. And so the two key terms here are clearly death and awareness. So the path of deathless, capital D, clearly deathless here is a synonym for nirvana, right? If the problem is repeated birth and death, then the opposite of that would be deathlessness, never having to die again, because once you die, you are reborn. And then, so that much should be familiar to you already, but how about awareness? Awareness is really interesting here because, okay, hold on, I opened up the Q&A. Let me close that. Okay. Oh, I see. Great. Awareness. So let me get back to awareness. Sorry for that interruption. Awareness speaks to the importance of the mind and consciousness, and by extension, meditation to Buddhism. So the path of deathless is awareness. And so by awareness, we can understand this to mean self-awareness, mindfulness, meditation, concentration, wisdom, and so forth. And so I think you get the point from this quote. Awareness brings you to nirvana. Unawareness, ignorance, having a lack of clarity about the actual situation, that is, quote, the path of death. All right. And then the third quote I want to share with you is this one. Knowing this body as a pot of clay, securing this mind as a citadel, one may fight death with wisdom's weapon, guard what has been gained, and be unattached. So this is a wordy quote, but let's focus on the first two lines. Knowing this body as a pot of clay. So this speaks to awareness, and it speaks to wisdom, and obviously renunciation. So it says that, once we understand ourselves as being, conditioned by karma, as being, caught up in this realm of conditionality beyond our control, that clearly what we think of as me and mine and myself is not really that substantial or that permanent or that autonomous. Instead, it's just like a pot of clay, empty and very fragile. So it says, understand that your body, your physicality, it's fragile, it's contingent, and so forth. And so what do you actually have control over? That's your mind. So secure it as a citadel, as a fortress, as something that's secure and can protect itself. One may fight death with wisdom's weapon. I love this. So how can you fight against death and samsara and ignorance and karma? It's with wisdom's weapon. And wisdom's weapon is an outgrowth of understanding that your body is like a pot of clay and that your mind is something you can control and strengthen and utilize. Okay, so we've talked about karma, samsara, and nirvana. Buddhist concepts, important aspects of Buddhist doctrine. Now I would like to retain, our discussion of these terms, but now pivot to society, to actual Buddhist culture on the ground with real monks and real lay people. And let's try to see how it all works together. So earlier I mentioned that Buddhism was, part and parcel of the Renunciant Movement, and that, the Renunciant Movement advocated renouncing society, wearing robes, and being poor and wandering and celibate and whatnot. All right, but the triad of karma, samsara, and nirvana in the real world led to a very interesting institutional development, one in which the monks, the majority of monks, most of the time, functioned as priests. And so what I'm going to do now is to explain how those three terms, samsara, karma, and nirvana, kind of undergird the economics of the monastic order. A monastic order of monks, but monks who, for the most part, work in their daily lives as priests. So let's bring back this notion of samsara and nirvana. So samsara is more or less, equivalent to society, to domestic life, to being entangled in relationships, needing to farm, being beholden to the seasons and natural disasters and the inequality in social life and so forth. That is more or less samsara. All right. Now, what about nirvana? Earlier, we talked about nirvana as, the extinction of the causes of samsara. Okay. And that still holds. But in everyday life, in society, in the real world, what is nirvana? Or what is a symbol or representative of nirvana? That would be the monastery and the ascetic life, right? The monastery and the ascetic life. Monasteries and monks, they do not partake in everyday economics. Monks don't get married. They don't buy things. They don't sell things. They don't cultivate land. In many ways, you could say they are unproductive, but unproductive by principle. It's because their lives and their institution is meant to be a representative or mirror nirvana, right? And nirvana is simply being the absence of all of the entanglements of cause and effect. All right, so if samsara is society and nirvana is the monastery, then does this mean that nirvana and samsara are, opposed to each other and that never the twain shall meet? No, that's not the case. And why? That's because of karma. So I just mentioned earlier that karma is the fuel. It's that perpetuates samsara. Every action leads to a reaction. All right. So in that way, you can say that your suffering in the here and now is caused by previous actions in earlier lives. And also the pleasures that you might be lucky enough to enjoy now, those were generated. The seeds of those were placed in previous lives when you did virtuous things. All right. So karma explains hardship and suffering. All right, that's true. But guess what? Karma doesn't explain all suffering and hardship. And so it does not. Buddhist doctrine in the sutras, it says that karma is a major source of your dis-ease and suffering, but there are other causes as well. Fate, spirits, negative astrological conjunctions. These are also forces that have an effect on the here and now. And then furthermore, karma and bad luck, those two things are not mutually contradictory. There's a quote from Spalding Gray. Some of you may know Spalding Gray, the great monologuist who did practice Buddhism. He's best known for his film, his one-man show, and then film Swimming to Cambodia. Anyways, he has another film called Gray's Anatomy, and there's a quote in there in which he quotes his therapist, and he says, oh, I thought I had written the quote down, but what he says is, all things are contingent, but there is also chaos in the world. In other words, shit happens. So excuse my language, but I think this is very apropos of Buddhism. Yes, all things are contingent. There's a perfectly sophisticated way of understanding cause and effect and interdependence, and ethics are built right into it. But at the same time, there is chaos. There's, you know, the stars can cause mischief. There are evil spirits lurking all over the place that can make you sick or give you, you know, bad luck or cause your business to go bad. It all, you know, happens together. All right, so now what's the point I'm driving at here? It's namely that the monks have to help the laity when it comes to their major issues. And their major issues are related to karma. How can they be good people in the world? But also, how can they deal with fate, spirits, and astrology? And so the way that the monks address this is by conducting rituals that counteract mundane forces. And by mundane, I mean, you know, worldly forces like spirits and the evil eye. And the monks also teach Buddhist virtues. And so in this way, samsara, nirvana, karma, it all works together. And between the laity and the monastic order, there's a symbiotic relationship. The laity need the monks for protection, for healings, and for instruction. And the monks need the laity for alms, for donations of food and work. Because, as I mentioned earlier, the monasteries are non-productive. And so, with this, you know, close relationship to, rather between the monks and the laity, you unsurprisingly see an emphasis at major Buddhist sites such as Dunhuang on patronage, memorials, rituals, and religious observances that bring together the laity and the monks. And so this explains the image that's been up on this slide for the last few minutes, where you have the Buddha, in this way a stand-in for the monks, and patrons. Samsara and nirvana coexisting, and the commonality being, you know, the things I've mentioned before. So that's the first part of my talk. And now I'm going to take a sip of water and you know, answer your questions. So let me see how I can stop the sharing and turn my camera back on.
Hello, Jann.
Hi.
We have some good questions that have been coming in while you've been speaking. So I'll give you a second there to take the sip of water.
Great, I'm curious to hear the questions.
All right, our first one is, I've been wondering about the differences between what the Buddha taught and later monastic elaborations on his teachings. Is there a major difference between his original teachings and how it was later interpreted and handed down by monastic communities? And if so, like, I know there could be a lot of material that could encompass, but what would you say the main differences are?
That's a very important theme. And so different people have different ways of addressing this.
Right.
For some, there's an implicit sort of periodization to the question. And I'll go a little further and say there's an implicit sort of theory of decline.
Okay.
Right, where original Buddhism, early Buddhism was pure, and then there were these later, you know, changes and compromises and accretions coming from the outside world. Yes. So that's one way to look at it. And that's a very, valid way to talk about things. Indeed, that's the Buddhist way of looking at things. Buddhism, and if I had more time, I would talk about additional Buddhist concepts, such as impermanence, right? Impermanence is one of the venerable Buddhist notions. Well, the Buddhists say all things are impermanent, including Buddhism. So the Buddhists are the first to say that, Buddhism was best while the Buddha was alive. And it's kind of been, all downhill from there. But that's just one of the rhetorics. And it was very common in China. I think it's called the Mofa. That's the trace dharma, right? That's the latter days of the law, as the great exhibition was titled. All right, so that's one way to look at it. But I was trying to skirt around that and to say that, no, the samsara, karma, nirvana complex is structural. It's built into Buddhism. We cannot point to a Buddhism that wasn't like this, that didn't involve monks and the laity together. The monks from day one, I mean, if we want to believe anything about the earliest monks, is that they didn't engage in commerce and they didn't farm, and that they relied on alms. So from day one, if they wanted to live, they had to be in relationship. And it's a perfectly valid Orthodox Buddhist idea that there's karma and also chaos, and that lay people need these services. That's how they can provide some compassion and benefit to the world. So I'll just leave it at that for now. But yes,
that's an excellent summary. Thank you. So our second question is also fairly complex.
Good.
Does Buddhism provide any evidence of rebirth, or is it considered a given, the truth of which adherents must take for granted?
That's another great and complicated question. I love it. I haven't been in the classroom in a couple of years, and these are exactly the kinds of questions, of course, people ask all the time. And so Buddhism, yes, certainly has, a whole theory of reincarnation. And it's really crucial to Buddhism. So let me just begin by saying that it's not a kind of an optional idea for Orthodox Buddhism. I was kind of hinting at this earlier, but when I said, samsara is a big deal. Samsara means uncontrolled birth and rebirth, death and re-death. It's not just, oh, I stubbed my toe and, life can be a drag. I mean, if you're really going to, give your life over to spirituality, it has to be because you are trying to address big issues. And so for them, the big issue is samsara, reincarnation. So I just want to begin with that. And so there are some, Orthodox Buddhist teachers these days who like to kind of get the noses of their Western converts out of shape by reminding them that they can't be wishy-washy about reincarnation. You have to believe it. Okay, now let me just answer the question. How do they know it's real? What I'll say in just 30 seconds or less is that the proofs for Buddhism have to do with the mind. So Buddhism is dualistic in a couple of different ways. One of the dualisms that it holds is to a mind-body dualism. The body does not generate consciousness. The brain is not the engine of the mind. Only like can produce like. The body is physical. It can only create other physical things. It can grow and it can create waste. The mind can only come from mental matter, mental material. And so how does that work? A moment of consciousness can only come from a prior moment of consciousness. That's how mind works. Mind is momentary. All right, so my current state of mind is caused and conditioned by the earlier moment. The earlier moment of consciousness is the raw material for my current present moment of consciousness, and it also determines sort of like my state of mind. All right, so we can take this back ad infinitum to the moment of conception.
Right.
Moment of conception. Where does your body come from? It comes from your mother and father, from the joining of their sexual fluids. Okay, so that explains where you get your body from. What about your mind? Your mind isn't coming from that matter. It's coming from a previous moment of consciousness. So the very moment of conception, when the sentient being is formed, the body, that can be easily explained. We would all agree that, conception, gestation work, more or less in a universal way. But the Buddhists will say that at that very moment, a mental continuum is moving from the bardo or a previous life right into this new life. And the reason a given mental continua would choose or be directed towards one little, microscopic body or another has to do with karma.
Okay.
So whether you're born into a family that's going to make you happy and give you lots of, things to allow you to flourish or not is conditioned by karma. So I'll just say that in brief, for Buddhists, that's the big deal. They say that it's irrefutable that mind comes from mind. And so your very first moment of consciousness has to come from a prior moment. And that prior moment is therefore a prior life.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
That's a very good way of answering it.
Yeah.
Thank you. Our next question is, what is the difference between Mahayana Buddhism and Theravada Buddhism or Theravadic Buddhism? I'm confused.
You are confused, or the question?
I'm not confused, but the question is,
okay,
that I'm confused.
All right, great. All right, so generally speaking, there are two major strands of Buddhism. There is what they call mainstream Buddhism or early Buddhism. So these are the same thing here, mainstream or early. These are the schools that trace themselves, directly back to earliest Buddhism. Early Buddhism had a number of different sort of schools, but they were really just lines of monastic practice. So early on, there were not a lot of doctrinal debates over major issues in Buddhist thought. There were, arguments and conflicts over monastic lineages. So that's why they call, early Buddhism, that's why they can call it all just like early Buddhism or mainstream Buddhism. It was, found all over the Indian subcontinent, and there's a lot of continuity in their teachings. All right, that's early Buddhism. And then, and so these days, to be nice, they call it mainstream Buddhism. And I'll get to what I mean by nice in a second. But then about the 1st century BCE, so 100 years before Christ, a new movement, a reform movement grew up. It sprouted up. And we don't, because this was so long ago, we can't pinpoint exactly where it first sprouted up or who was involved, but we do have some very, very early texts from this period. And this is largely thought to have been a reform movement. And this gets to the first question that was asked. Basically, some monks said, look around, look at all this corruption. Mm-hmm. This isn't good. We need to clean house. We need to reform. So we're going to go back into the forest and we're going to live the way they used to live in the good old days. And so this group called itself the Mahayana. And Maha means great. And Yana is vehicle, the great vehicle. So there's a book about early Mahayana by a scholar named Jann. It's not me, Jann Ronis, but Jann Ronis, a superior scholar and senior scholar, Jann Ronis. She has a book about early Mahayana. It's one of her specialties, and it's called A Few Good Men. Oh. It's a hilarious title, but A Few Good Men. So it's a allusion to the marketing slogan of the Marines. a few good men. And so what she means by that is that the earliest Mahayana that we have proof of, or that we have records of, saw itself as a reform movement for the proud and the few. You know, the really good monks who were able to, you know, leave the city, the monasteries in the city, and go into the countryside and live ascetic lives. So I'll just leave it at that. But then the Mahayana started to grow and grow and grow and spread to China. And so the Mahayana is sometimes called Northern Buddhism, because most Buddhism in the northern climes of Asia, North India, the Silk Road, Mongolia, Tibet, China, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, that's all Mahayana for the most part. And then Theravada. Okay, so let's talk about Theravada. First of all, Theravada. Thera means elder. And Vada is the same word as yana. Oh, no, it's not. I take it back. Oh, my God. Never mind. Sorry. Revoke my Buddhism credentials. Vada is not yana. Okay, but it's the way of the elders. Theravada means the way of the elders. All right, so they are derived from mainstream Buddhism, from those earliest schools of Buddhism. And they're, in fact, the only school that seems to have survived from that early period. And they're found throughout Southeast Asia. But what I want to just say here is that as Buddhist scholars, we don't want to just replicate all of the polemics, the infighting between the Mahayana and the Theravada. Right. So the Mahayana, we don't have to believe that it's great or greater than anybody else, or that they're you know, they're reformed and everyone else needs reformation. And likewise, the Theravada, that was a long time ago that it, you know, first came into the world. And so these days, there's a heavy dose of kind of a reimagining of themselves as the pure earliest school. So that's a very prominent part of how the Theravada presents itself now, but before it was confronted with, say, you know, the Mahayana and global Buddhism, it wasn't necessarily so caught up in the rhetoric and the appearance of being, you know, early.
Early, right.
So I'll leave it there.
So early in opposition to Mahayana.
Early in opposition, and with early in the sense of this rhetoric of decline. Like, we're from we represent the pre-decline days. And of course, the Mahayana tried to address decline in its own way. And there's all kinds of doctrinal differences, but let's just leave it there for now. When did they pop up? Mahayana, early, and it's found in the north. Theravada, Southeast Asia. Sri Lanka, Burma, Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam, hotbeds of Theravada.
Okay, perfect. Jen, thank you so much. We have a number of other questions that have come in.
I'm sure.
But seeing as we've reached the end of this Q&A period, we're going to have to save them for the second one, which will be after your next period of lecture. But it is time for our intermission. So for 5 minutes, we're going to take a break. So I have 6:50 Central Time, 7:50 Eastern. So if we can adjourn and come back here at 6:55 Central, 7:55 Eastern, we look forward to welcoming you again then. Until soon.
In the first half, you know, I tried to talk about some Buddhist basics. And like I said, during the Q&A, I wanted to talk about, you know, what I see to be a kind of an enduring structure of Buddhist culture and Buddhist society. And you know, the sort of question I was trying to answer was, why is, you know, Buddhism in Dunhuang so devotional and ritualistic? And in part, it's because of the way Buddhism is organized, with the monks as priests conducting rituals and teachings and ceremonies for the laity. All right, now I'm going to talk about another aspect of Buddhism that also has to do with how and why Buddhism went to Dunhuang and Inner Asia and East Asia. more broadly. Okay, so this part of the talk is called Buddhism on a Mission, and I just happened to find on images.google.com an image of a monk who is walking across America. And because Christian and Julia and others are based in Texas, just so happened that they had a really good photo of him in Texas. I imagine that was taken in Texas, Amarillo. So Buddhism on a mission. In other words, Buddhism is a missionary religion. Buddhism would not have spread, across Asia, the width and breadth of Asia, and now around the world, if it, didn't have a missionary streak. And again, I'm using that term mission and missionary. I don't mean, for there to be any theological baggage tied up with that, but still, it is a religion that believes that other people can adopt it, and that actually wants to spread the religion, far and wide. So Buddhism was very successful at that. In the early text, the monks are encouraged to travel widely and to teach in the local languages. So, one thing that made the missionizing of Buddhism easy is that there is no sacred language to Buddhism. It doesn't have a Latin or an Arabic. Buddhism can easily be translated into the vernacular. That was never a problem, and it certainly was translated into Chinese and Tibetan and Korean and Japanese and Southeast Asian languages. There are prestige languages within Buddhism, Sanskrit namely, but there's no holy language that somehow is like the original or that is better than any other language for conveying the truths of Buddhism. Buddhism is actually very flexible when it comes to the verbal formulations in which the deeper Buddhist truths are expressed. All right, so Buddhism on a mission. Buddhists were not joking around when they started traveling and spreading the Dharma teachings all over. Here's the map that shows you just how extensively Buddhism spread throughout all of Asia. And so we don't have time to enumerate all these different regions and countries, and the text is so small it's hard to see the dates, but you can certainly get the gist that Buddhism started in North India and spread further north into present-day Pakistan and Afghanistan, and then across the Silk Road, of course, and then through Southeast Asia, which I mentioned before, but you can also see how it spread into not just continental Southeast Asia, but Sumatra, Indonesia, Bali, and other island nations. But today we're here to talk about Dunhuang. So here's a detail of a map about travel along the Silk Road. And so you can see towards the left, the bottom left of the map, that I put a red box around Kabul, just because that's a place that many of us know, to give you a sense of sort of the upper limits of South Asia, South Asian Buddhism, the Indian subcontinent, Kabul. So from there, travelers, merchants, mercenaries, and monks traveled first across, the treacherous and very wide swath of mountains to the Taklamakan Desert. So I'm not a specialist of this Silk Road per se, so I'm not going to give you too many details, but you can see that there's kind of a northern and a southern route. There's the arrow that's above the words Taklamakan Desert, and then the arrows that are below it. So the northern and southern routes. But both of them arrived at Dunhuang, which is also surrounded by a red box. And then to the right, you see Chang'an or Xi'an, and that's an important place in China, politically and culturally, and I think a common destination for the fabulous Dunhuang Foundation tours. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about the Silk Road. Here is a very evocative quote from Valerie Hansen, a major scholar of the Silk Road, who has a new popular book about it. And so the idea of the Silk Road, a singular thing that can easily be, identified, maybe even seen from space. That is, a mistaken notion. She says that there was no clearly marked paved route across Eurasia. There was nothing remotely like the Appian Way of Rome. But instead, there was a patchwork of drifting trails and unmarked footpaths. I love that. Drifting trails and unmarked footpaths. It doesn't sound too substantial or permanent. Because there was rarely a discernible route, travelers almost always hired guides to take them along a particular section, and they frequently shifted to another path if they encountered obstacles. So, in other words, the Silk Road was highly trafficked, but every caravan or every small group of travelers was pretty much on their own, bushwhacking it and making it up as they went along, reacting constantly to the weather, the terrain, to bandits, and the availability of food and so forth. And so there were these different trails, but these meandering trails definitely converged at oasis towns. And for us, the foremost oasis town, of course, is Dunhuang. So Buddhism first arrived in China at the beginning of the Common Era. So between in the 60s and 70s of the Common Era, and it arrived there in the Common Era, and for the first couple of centuries was something that was not super well proclaimed to the broader world. There were only certain types of people that were interested in it, and there were very many difficulties in terms of translation and intelligibility. But I wanted to say actually a little bit more about the Silk Road. Sorry, my notes have something out of order. Okay, so the Silk Road, we've established that there wasn't, say, a super highway leading across the desert. You had these meandering trails, but they converged at oases. All right, so far then we've just talked about the route itself, but what about the society and the politics along the Silk Road? Well, the Silk Road was home to large but very volatile empires. There were many small states and then broader confederations and empires. And when these empires were successful and able to establish some degree of stability, then there was trade, people flourished, and when travel was possible, people would travel along those routes from west to east and from east to west. And the reason these empires were important for stability and trade and cultural exchange is that the empires created a kind of a common framework of laws and regulations and so forth. Okay, that makes sense. That's what empires do. They are trans-regional, transcultural, but they're able to bring these different peoples and languages and groups, communities together under a sort of umbrella. It's often very loose and tenuous, but nevertheless, there's some degree of coherence. Well, I bring that up because in a similar way, religions can also work as empires, as cultural empires. And so just as an empire politically and economically creates a sort of a common framework that brings together disparate groups across long distances, the same is true for religions. Religions create religious and cultural sort of zones of shared faith and common religious institutions that overlap and transcend ethnic, cultural, and linguistic boundaries. And so if you recall the map I showed you earlier of Buddhism, across Asia, you'll see that Buddhism, in a way, that Asia was the domain of Buddhism. There was a kind of a Buddhist empire across Asia. Now, I mean that only loosely, because obviously this map is not meant to be a snapshot of one period of time. This map covers 1,000 years, over 1,000 years. So Buddhism wasn't found in all places and at all times, like you see here. But nevertheless, Buddhism was the sort of lingua franca, culturally, religiously, artistically, literarily, through much of Asia for a very long time. So Christian mentioned earlier that my specialty is Tibet and Tibetan Buddhism. Buddhism came to Tibet in the 7th century. Buddhism spread to Japan in the 6th century. It reached Korea in the 4th century, Southeast Asia in the 2nd century, China in the 1st century, as I've mentioned before. Okay, so we see that Buddhism was really on the march, and that it made its way into most areas of Asia, and it clearly gained a foothold, to put it mildly. Indeed, it became at times very hegemonic. It became the dominant cultural force in all of these areas. So why was that? Well, let's take Tibet as an example. Buddhism spread to Tibet in the 7th century. It's because at that time, Tibet was unified for the first time ever. And for the first time ever, it had military power and economic power, because it was actually very good at gaining control over certain segments of the Silk Road. And so it enriched itself off of customs and tariffs that it charged traders on the Silk Road. Okay, so Tibet, 7th century, it's finally on the world stage. Prior to this, it was not very unified, didn't have a language. It was definitely the backwaters. India, China, the major kingdoms of the Silk Road, they didn't think anything about Tibet. It was definitely a dark spot on the map. But Tibet becomes powerful, all of a sudden, it's on the world stage. Okay, but then they said, military power is not enough. We want to have a kind of a civilization, and we want to partake in the things that, will allow us to be more tightly integrated into, the broader Asian nexus. So they looked around, and, Buddhism was obviously the choice for them. There were other religious traditions they dabbled with and they experimented with, but Buddhism gave them the most cachet. By adopting Buddhism, they then had a commonality with India. And India is very far from Tibet. You have to cross the Himalayas to get there. So prior to this, there really wasn't a lot of connection there, certainly not culturally. Buddhism gave Tibet also something in common with China and with the Silk Road as well. So Tibet adopted Buddhism, and I'm just using Tibet as an example because it's near and dear to my heart, but the same can be said for Japan and Korea and Southeast Asia. But another reason to adopt Buddhism, again along these lines of Buddhism as an empire, is that it brought with it not just the religious doctrine and the monks, but all of the cultural baggage And I mean baggage here in the best possible sense. I mean the accumulated science, art, statecraft, legalism, and so forth that had sort of found its way into Buddhist literature. So when a group like the Tibetans or the Chinese decided to learn Buddhist languages and translate Buddhist texts, they weren't only getting Buddhist ideas, they were also gaining access to the high civilization of India. Again, statecraft, medicine, poetics, art, architecture, and so forth. So again, Buddhism as a kind of empire. Now, let's talk about China. So Buddhism in China or Chinese Buddhism, right? Which is it? Which is more appropriate? Well, actually, both are appropriate, but at different times. And I know that there's probably a difference of opinion on this, but let's just go with what the book says. The book says that Buddhism first arrived, and by book I mean our readings. Buddhism first arrived in China at the beginning of the Common Era, but like I mentioned a few minutes ago, it wasn't super widespread or well-known early on. In fact, Buddhism wasn't necessarily even thought of as Buddhism at that time. They didn't know about, like, say, a religion with an ism as a suffix. What most people in China in the 1st century, 2nd century CE were encountering were individual representatives of Buddhist culture. A couple of statues, or a monk who chanted in a foreign language and performed rituals. Or maybe even an individual Buddhist text that contained wisdom, but the wisdom wasn't understood to be part and parcel of this institution that was a world religion. I hope that makes sense. I'm sure you can understand how when certain fragments of Buddhism first arrived in China, it was difficult to know what to make of them and what more lay behind these individual statues and texts and figures. But over time, the languages were learned and so forth. So if I had more time, I could talk about how the arrival of, or rather the assimilation of Buddhism in China involved a lot of challenges. But I'll just go through a few of them now. Most of the foreigners who arrived in China to spread Buddhism were Buddhists, they were monks, but they weren't Indian necessarily. In fact, there were very few masters who were born and raised and trained in India who went to China, and definitely not during the earliest days. Indian masters started coming to India in large numbers only after the maritime trade routes were opened up. But right now we're talking about the days of the Silk Road, the terrestrial Silk Road. So my point is that the Chinese didn't exactly have access to representatives of Buddhism from India itself. So they were getting Buddhism from people who themselves were, secondhand Buddhists, so to speak. And by that, I don't mean for there to be any kind of judgment. I'm not a Buddhist purist. I'm a scholar. So I revel in the adaptability of Buddhism and in the diversity and creativity of the local traditions. So I want to just explain that. But nevertheless, it is important to point out that when the Chinese were meeting Buddhists, they were meeting people who were sort of second and third hand Buddhists. And then once translation started to take place, it was quite rare for translation to happen directly from Sanskrit right into Chinese. Often what you had were Central Asian monks who knew their local language, but were trained in Sanskrit, They understood Buddhism, through their own linguistic filter, and then maybe they understood colloquial Chinese to some degree. So then they would translate texts into colloquial Chinese. So Sanskrit, not their native language, colloquial Chinese, not their native language, and then that oral interpretation would then be written down in classical Chinese. And so all of this, led to some interesting, new ideas and developments. But, the linguistic aspect of this is only part of it. There's the transmission of the content, but then there's also the reception of Buddhism. And that too is necessarily heavily mediated by the cultural and civilizational framework of the people on the receiving end of Buddhism. And in this case, we're talking about Chinese people in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries of the Common Era. Not just the cultural, civilizational framework they had, but also the needs that they brought to Buddhism. They weren't interested in Buddhism just because they heard it was cool, but they brought to it certain religious desires and necessities that were determined by Chinese culture, not by Buddhism. So this is all to say that the transmission to Buddhism was very textured, it was very halting, but nevertheless, it was, one of the great cultural success stories in all human history. To think that, the entirety of Buddhism spread all the way to China and was adopted and assimilated and embraced, and that it became dominant in Chinese culture. That's amazing. And so I just want to end with a couple of points, because we don't have too much time, but I want to just bring up a couple of themes for you to think about. They might inform your future readings or your travels in China. So how is it that the Chinese went from Buddhism in China to Chinese Buddhism? One way to think of this process is in terms of domestication, the domestication of Buddhism. And again, not being a Buddhist purist, domestication for me and for most scholars is not a bad word. Domestication is unavoidable. That's how it always happens. So what are some of the ways in which Buddhism was domesticated? How did China figure out ways to make Buddhism, seem fitting to their setting? Well, one is to compose myths about the destiny of the arrival of Buddhism in China. And so you get this in the reading. In chapter 1, she talks about how there was the myth of the arrival of the first Buddhist texts as dreamt by an emperor. So that might have just seemed like an interesting, colorful example, something kind of quaint to you, but no, this myth appears in all of the Buddhist textbooks that we have explaining Chinese Buddhism, because it was so important to the Chinese understanding about why Buddhism, came to China and why it, belonged there. So they wrote myths about their arrival. Then there were certain places that were understood to be the abodes of Buddhist deities. Shan is seen to be, it's a high mountain, one of the main Buddhist pilgrimage sites. It's thought to be the home, the earthly abode of one of the main Buddhist deities, Samantabhadra. And then, of course, there's Shan, where you can have an encounter with Manjushri. So that's another way in which Buddhism was domesticated. And then, again, like I said earlier, I revel in the creativity and I would say the daring of the Buddhists who tried to make Buddhism their own. And so one of the more exciting ways in which this happened in China was through the composition of apocryphal sutras. So some of you may not know that term. Some of you may know the term apocrypha. It's a theological term, but to explain what it means in the Buddhist case, these are sutras, so Buddhist scriptures, which claim to be spoken by the Buddha and translated into Chinese, but are in fact Chinese compositions. So these are sutras, these are texts that were written in China, in Chinese, by Chinese monks for a Chinese audience, and they speak to Chinese issues, Chinese needs, and Chinese sort of proclivities. So another way that Buddhism became domesticated was by writing texts that basically make the Buddha seem like he really understood Chinese civilization and taught doctrines and practices and values that were totally in alignment with Chinese Buddhism, or on occasion, which challenged some issues in Chinese culture. And then lastly, speaking of bold measures, Chinese Buddhists, even on occasion, created new deities that were Buddhist in identity, but were new entities that again were developed in order to address the needs of Chinese people and Chinese Buddhists. And so the reading I gave you, two chapters from a book called Chinese Buddhism, A Thematic History by Junfang Yu. So her major magnum opus was a book called Guanyin, about Guanyin Pusa, the goddess of compassion, goddess of mercy. And that book is a story of how the Indian male bodhisattva, Avalokiteshvara, in China became domesticated so thoroughly that it underwent a change of gender, so that in present-day China, Guanyin, the name is the same, but this deity is understood to be female, and the history of this change is forgotten by mainstream Buddhists. That's pretty bold to take a deity and to say, we like Avalokiteshvara, he's great, but we have our own needs for a female deity, needs for more of an emphasis on mercy and compassion. So we're going to project these issues within Chinese society and religiosity. We're going to project them, or we're going to sort of externalize them in a Buddhist idiom, so that we come up with an element of Buddhism that's, core to the tradition, but is absolutely, something that we want and we need. Who cares whether it's, a so-called, aberration or a taking of liberties. They didn't pay any mind to that. So I think that's fantastic. Now, give me 3 minutes left. So I just want to talk about Buddhism coming to the West. This may have to be a talk for another time, but I think it's really important. And so I just wanted to say that Buddhism first came to Hawaii and then to California in the 1840s and 50s. There were many Chinese immigrants during the gold rush period and during the construction of the transcontinental railroad. And then in 1868, China and the United States signed the Burlingame Treaty, which created a kind of a most favored trading status, friendly nation status between the two nations. However, there was a lot of anti-Chinese racism and discrimination right from the earliest times. And so even though the Chinese came to work out in the mountains for the gold rush and out in the countryside on the railroads, the violence and the discrimination caused them by the 1860s and 70s to live largely in Chinese enclaves in the cities because they could only find safety there. And so it's in these Chinese enclaves in the cities of California that you find the first temples. And so here's a landmark from one that was founded in 1863. Fantastic. And a handful are still operating. And so there's so much to say about all this. I think I'm just going to have to leave it. But let me conclude with one image. And it's the cover of a book called The Bodhi Tree Grows in LA. So earlier I said that one of the ways that domestication occurs is by, finding a place for Buddhism in the adoptive country. In fact, maybe that's not the right way to phrase it. The better way to say it is to find Buddhist places in the adoptive country. And so that is not what was consciously going on in the mind of this author, but I think that this is exactly what's happening. The Bodhi tree grows in LA. The Bodhi tree, this is the tree under which the Buddha sat 2,500 years ago when he meditated and attained enlightenment. And what is this Sri Lankan monk saying in his book? That, you know what, the Bodhi tree grows in LA too. You can find authentic Buddhism in America. Southern California is, perfectly orthodox. This is the kind of thing that goes on. So if I had more time, I would have explained how a lot of these same domestications have occurred in the States. They're not identical, but it's a similar process. So thank you very much for your time. It's been really interesting. I hope that some of you will stick around for a few minutes of question and answer. So again, my organization is called the Buddhist Digital Resource Center. We're launching our new website on Saturday at www.bdrc.io. And please visit it. And feel free to reach out to me, Jann, at bdrc.io. So with that, why don't we open up the floor to Q&A?
We have some questions, Jann. Thank you so much. That was so illuminating. We have questions that date back to the first part of the lecture, so we might jump a little bit.
All right, that's fine.
The first one is, if karma comes in our future life, how does one know that his or her virtuous actions would indeed achieve nirvana in this life or the next or the one after that? Is it a leap of faith, really?
Yes. In brief, Buddhism accepts 3 types of knowledge. And so, okay, I'll give a short answer. Buddhism accepts 3 types of knowledge: inference, direct experience, and scriptural authority. So what I mean by that is Buddhism, we talked earlier about awareness, the mind, concentration, mindfulness, wisdom, dealing with emotional and cognitive issues. That's all very here and now. Buddhism has always put an emphasis on empiricism and making changes that you can verify for yourself. And so Buddha said at one time, if I tell you something, you don't have to accept it on blind faith. You shouldn't accept it just because you revere me. You have to test it out. He said, just like a goldsmith will test out a piece of gold by scraping it, cutting it, burning it. In the same way, you should thoroughly investigate Buddha's teachings. And so, Buddhism admits that there's a lot that you can verify for yourself.
Okay.
Mindfulness, concentration. If you do that, they tell you, you don't have to wait until your next life to reap the benefits. In fact, all the benefits will come now. You'll be calm. Your blood pressure will go down. And earlier, we did talk about how do you know about reincarnation, and Buddhism sets out this inferential logic. Where does your present mental state come from? It comes from a previous mental state, okay, and on and on and on, ad infinitum to your previous life. But they do also say that there are a few things that you cannot verify on your own, not through direct experience or inference. And one of them is future lives. You can't tell what your future life is going to be because there's just too many causes and conditions. It hasn't happened yet.
Too many
Anything
factors.
could intervene. Yeah. So I will just leave it at that. That Buddhism has a very empirical style to it, but it also understands that there are a few things, very important things, such as future lives. What exactly is going to happen in a future life that they say that you just have to take on faith. And faith isn't the right word. They would say the authority of Buddha's word. And now the Buddha is omniscient. So Buddha knows what he's talking about, but the rest of us just have to take his word for it. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. Our second question is, following up on the evolution of Buddhism, does the art of Dunhuang represent a different world than contemporary Buddhism in China?
Does the art of Buddhism at Dunhuang represent a different world from contemporary art in China?
Yes, the world of contemporary Buddhism in China.
Oh, the world of contemporary Buddhism. Okay, so that's a very good question. I'm really glad this was asked because this gets to the main topic that I wanted to cover at the very last part of the text. All right, so now what you have, the kind of newest development in global Buddhism is what's called Buddhist Modernism. Mm-hmm. Buddhist Modernism. So Buddhist Modernism is something that actually originated in Asia, but then sort of simultaneously you also had little sprouts of Buddhist modernism in the West, and then they sort of spoke to each other, and now you have Buddhist modernism in Bangkok and Singapore and Beijing, but also in Berkeley and in Boston. And so what is Buddhist modernism? Buddhist modernism is, as with all modernisms, it's self-consciously, in opposition to tradition.
Right.
And opposition might be too strong of a word, but it certainly, sees itself as different and a departure. So Buddhist modernism. Buddhist modernism is experiential. And again, I'm using their language now, so please don't understand there to be any value judgments here, but they want to say, I want to believe in things that I can experience. My Buddhism isn't going to be the Buddhism of my grandma who tells me, wear this amulet and just trust me. This is what's always been done in the family. You have to do it. No, they want it to be experiential. And this, an outgrowth of this is that meditation is very important in Buddhist modernism. And by meditation, I mean like self-cultivation. Meditation is a very broad word. Ritual can be meditation. But by meditation here, I mean, kind of inward-looking self-cultivation. Now, another aspect of Buddhist modernism is that it's study-based. Not only is it experiential-based, but it's study-based. People want to go back to the texts. They don't want to just listen to sermons or derive their doctrines in a kind of implicit way from stories. They want to say, you know what, I'm a modern educated person. I can read those sutras myself. Yes, in the old days, only the monks, dared deal with, difficult Buddhist classical works. But hey, I've got a master's degree in computer science. I bet I could read them. I want access to Buddhist texts. So it's scripture-based, and it's also rationalistic, as you can imagine. And then Buddhist modernism it definitely de-emphasizes rituals and ritualism. And there's in a way, a diminished role for the clergy in Buddhist modernism. And so like the kind of fullest embodiment of this would be, entirely lay-based Buddhist movements in the West, where There are no monks, and they don't feel like they're missing out by not having, an assembly of monks in their community. So it's, lay people doing it for themselves. But in a more kind of everyday sense, you get this at Asian Buddhist temples. Say a Cambodian temple, a temple, that was established by and for, the Cambodian ethnic community in Waltham or in Long Beach or something. There, you have this interesting new development where these are nonprofits and the boards are run by the laity. Oh. And now all of a sudden, the laity are, actually structurally superior to the monks.
Wow.
And, you had this 100 years ago, often, but now these lay people, the kind of lay people in the 21st century who would want to be on the board, they actually want to sort of say, okay, the monks, we need you. We can't have Buddhism without you, but there has to be a power sharing from here on out. That's the modern way. So I'll leave it at that. That's how contemporary Buddhism differs. But what I want to say is that there's a spectrum. A lot of Buddhist modernism is still very much rooted in the values, the imagery, and the practices and the scriptures of traditional Buddhism. Buddhist modernism is not like a rejection of tradition. It's not a reform movement. But these new emphases certainly are something contemporary. And calling them modern, adds value judgments that many of us may actually like, but nevertheless, it's something new. Mm-hmm.
Wow, that's fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah,
we have sort of a lightning round here with some shorter questions mixed in with some longer ones. The first is, can lay people attain nirvana themselves by practices and rituals, or only monks in the monastery?
Okay, I'm sorry, say that again.
Can lay people attain nirvana themselves by practices and rituals, or only monks in the monastery? So can lay people attain nirvana, or is it only monks who can attain nirvana?
So the short answer is that both can attain nirvana, and that in the earliest texts, nirvana doesn't seem to have been that difficult to achieve. In the earliest texts, all over the place, you see pious lay people meeting the Buddha in the forest and having an aha moment and, attaining a high level of enlightenment. That kind of thing happened. But then over time, I don't mean to bring in a rhetoric of decline, but I would just say that in the Orthodox text, you definitely have lay people just sort of spontaneously attaining enlightenment after encountering Buddhism, doing a little bit of practice. And it didn't take that many lifetimes for the monks to attain nirvana in the more traditional way through study and practice. But over time, two things happened. One, nirvana became further and further and further away. So much so that if you go to certain Southeast Asian countries, Theravada countries, they will tell you that there are no more enlightened people on earth. That we're in such an age of decline that it is simply impossible to attain enlightenment anymore. And they're fine with that. They want to do a lot of practices and hope to be reborn during the future Buddha. And then they'll be able to attain enlightenment. And there's nothing wrong with, what I mean to say is, in Buddhism, it's a very long path. It can be. So having to wait until the next Buddha that's certainly shorter than waiting for 5 Buddhas from now, which is what you would do if you didn't start practicing in the here and now. So that's all right. But parallel with that lengthening of the path, you also had another track of Buddhism where it became shortened and shortened and shortened and shortened. And that led to all kinds of practices that promised Buddhism in the here and now, in one body and one life. And also the doctrine of Buddha nature, where they said, actually, you're already enlightened. The only illusion is that you're unenlightened.
Oh, that's interesting. So
yes. So So just to say that Buddhism is a very diverse and super creative, super intellectual religion overall, and they've come up with every possible permutation of the path. So yes, they can attain it, and no, they can't. It just depends on which tradition or time period.
Okay. We have two more questions. We actually have more than that, but what I'm going to ask is for people to send them. So I'm going to combine these last two into one. The first part is, how many Buddhas are there? And the second part is, I would like a distinction about the historical Buddha and other Buddhas. The many artistic renderings seem to indicate many who have become enlightened. How does this work within the framework of the religion?
That's great. Okay, so this brings us all the way back to samsara. So samsara, the cycle of life, unending birth and death. So there's no forward motion that's inherent to reality. It's just, cycle of birth and death. Nirvana is, just pulling out of that cycle. It's not a destination. It's not a thing. It's just, the extinction of that for an individual. But samsara is cyclical. Okay, so now that's part of the general framework. Another is that within samsara, kind of this, just incessant cycle, there are ages, what they call these different ages to the universe. So there's a period in which, like we're in now, the universe is formed. There's multiple planets. We can see them with telescopes and all of that. And then there will be, following this, after many hundreds of millions of years, the age of dissolution. It'll all fall apart. Then there'll be an age of vacuity, nothing for a long time. And then there'll be a kind of a big bang moment, and then it'll start back up again. So those are eons. And one of those 4-part cycles would be an eon. What I'm getting at is that every, several hundred eons, then you have another Buddha.
Okay.
And he comes and he teaches, and then, a lot of people attain enlightenment, and then there's a slow decline. And then a long period when there's no Buddhism on earth, so to speak, and everyone is just benighted and hopeless. And then the whole universe, just it catches on fire, and then there's floods, and then there's winds, and then the whole thing just becomes nothing, and then it starts up again. So every age has a Buddha, and each Buddha is different. So in a way, there's an infinite number of Buddhas, because there's going to be an infinite number of ages. It's never going to stop. There's always going to be samsara, according to the dominant understanding of it. And each of these Buddhas is different. But now within this kind of infinite time frame, they also speak about schools of Buddhas. And so right now there are, someone in the audience could correct me, but there's 1,008 Buddhas to this fortunate eon. So the kind of broader time period we're in right now is called the fortunate eon. And that has, I think, 1,008 Buddhas. But the time periods in between each of those Buddhas is geologic time. It's hundreds of millions of years. And so they're all different. But that being said, they all have the exact same enlightenment, and their teachings are always the same. So it's like repetition. Yes, there's consistency. And so each of those Buddhas is the outgrowth of one individual who practiced over many, many lifetimes and became a Buddha.
Okay. And
I hope nobody's going to ask about what the difference is between Buddhahood and Nirvana.
Nobody asked that.
Nobody asked that. Look it up on Wikipedia. That'll be another 10 minutes.
Well, as I mentioned,
But there's a big difference.
Oh, wow. You can go on for ages. It's so complex, and the doctrines are so rich. There's just so much you can tease out of this. We actually have a few more questions. For those poor people I did not get to, I'm sorry. In the interest of time, since we're coming up on 8 p.m. or 9 p.m. if you're on the East Coast, I'd ask if you have a remaining question that we weren't able to get to, please send it to us as a reply to the Zoom invitation you received in your inbox. We will receive it and we will forward it to Jann to answer for you. So I'm just sorry we weren't able to get to it within the time frame allotted, but these were excellent questions as well, so we want to make sure that they're also addressed. Now I'd like to close. Jann, thank you again for this incredibly illuminating presentation on Buddhism, its history, its journey to the West, and how the Bodhi tree is growing in LA even to this day. That's really a wonderful way of illustrating the trajectory of Buddhism into the present era. You greatly expanded our understanding of the religion, so thank you again. I'd like to thank our audience for tuning in and for being so patient, to everybody who stuck it out through all of this time, through both Q&A periods. And as a final reminder, as Chris mentioned at the beginning of our talk, I'd like to invite you to join us again in 2 weeks' time. That would be August 13th at 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central. And that will be for our next lecture with Anne Fung from Boston University, and she will present on the art of Dunhuang. So we will speak further about Buddhism, but in an art historical or strictly art historical context. So thank you, Jann. Thank you, everyone. And I'd like to wish you all a very good evening.
Thank you, Julia and Christian and Mimi and the audience. It's been wonderful. I hope to see you all again.
We hope to see you again soon. Take care.
Take care.